Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we're following humanity as it wanders even farther from Africa and West Asia, drifting into regions that must have felt like entirely new worlds. The pace is still slow. The choice is still accidental. No one is building maps, drawing borders, or planning giant journeys. People are still just following food, water, and their own curiosity. But the land ahead is different. Thicker forests, stranger animals, wetter climates, an entire continent no human had ever walked on. So let's ease into it, reaching the deep southeast, where the land frays into islands by the time humans wandered through Southeast Asia. The world was in one of those geological moods where sea levels kept swinging up and down every few thousand years. During colder periods, ice sheets sucked up huge amounts of seawater, lowering coastlines dramatically. That meant large parts of Southeast Asia were connected by land, what scientists call Sunderland. Early humans didn't know this was temporary. They just saw wide plains, big rivers, deep forests, and lots of animals that ranged from adorable to absolutely not adorable. Life here was warm, humid, sticky, buzzing, with insects that had no mercy whatsoever. But it was abundant. Food grew all year. Fish were everywhere. Shelter was easy, and storms were predictable enough. Unless they weren't, so groups settled. Not permanently, just for a few seasons, then a few years, then a few generations, and some drifted farther into what are now Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and beyond. To them, it wasn't island hopping. It was just walking. The land was connected then, but that connection wouldn't last forever. When humans first saw Australia without knowing it as some groups drifted farther southeast, they reached a region where the land grew sparse and the sea came closer. But during low sea levels, Australia, New Guinea, and nearby islands formed a single giant landmass called Sahul. Crossing into Sahul required the first significant sea journey in human history. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. It was probably just a few families using simple rafts or floating debris. Pushed by gentle currents and wind, they might have been aiming for a closer island. They might have been riding out a storm. They might have been following birds that seemed to be going somewhere promising. Whatever the reason, humans eventually crossed a few miles of open water and found themselves in a land so strange it must have felt like walking into a dream. The animals were unlike anything they'd ever seen. Giant kangaroos, massive, flightless birds, marsupials bouncing. Everywhere are creatures that looked like a mix between a bear and a beaver and, of course, the ancestors of the modern Australian wildlife that still looks like it was designed by someone. Pulling an all-nighter, this was a new world, a truly different continent, and humans adapted to it in their usual, relaxed, unhurried way. Australia, a slow adjustment to a harsh content Australia, wasn't gentle. Hot deserts, weird rains, plants with defensive strategies that felt personal, animals that moved in ways humans didn't quite expect, signs of water that lied sometimes. But early humans learned. Where rain pooled after storms, where shade lasted the longest, though, to gather edible plants without regretting itho to hunt. Animals that hopped instead of ran how to manage fire deliberately. To refresh the land, how to navigate vast open spaces using stars, sense, and memory, and they developed one of the oldest continuous cultural traditions in human history, the beginnings of Aboriginal culture, which would remain connected to this land for tens of thousands of years, all built from quiet trial and quiet error. While some drifted south, others drifted east, moving back to mainland Asia. Humans didn't spread in just one direction. Some pushed down into Australia. Others moved northeast, following river valleys, grasslands, and seasonal game. This brought them into China, Korea, and eventually the edge of Siberia, regions with climates that couldn't have been more different from tropical Southeast Asia. Imagine walking through humid forests one generation and having your grandchildren grow up in frozen landscapes with 6-month winters. This wasn't planned. It was just the slow, natural rhythm of movement multiplied over thousands of years. East Asia, where humanity learned to be flexible. Asia was diverse in every sense. Southern China had forests and warm rivers. Northern China had cold steppes and sharp seasons. The Korean Peninsula, mixed mountains, and coastal Japan, still connected by lower sea levels, at times offered mild climates and abundant fishing. Groups settled in different niches and adapted gently over time. In southern regions, people relied on tropical forests for fruit, nuts, and small animals. In northern regions, hunting strategies changed. You needed insulation, teamwork, and a good understanding of seasonal prey over generations. Skeletal builds and features began reflecting the environments. Again, not dramatically, just small adjustments shaped by climate and diet. Humans were becoming a patchwork of regional adaptations without ever realizing it. Siberia, the slow march into cold extremes now. Let's drift into one of the harshest regions early humans ever entered, Siberia. Why did they go there? Probably because a herd went there, and humans were addicted to following herds. They didn't mean to march into a cold wasteland full of ice storms, mammoths, and air that felt like punishment. But they did, slowly, cautiously, one sheltered valley at a time. The first humans in Siberia must have wondered why the air bit their faces so aggressively. Their fires needed more fuel. Their clothes needed more layers. Their shelters needed to block wind from every direction except, maybe, downward. This was where humanity learned cold survival at its highest level. They adapted by hunting large animals for fat and warm hides, building deep shelters insulated with bones, hides, unearth-forming tight-knit social groups that shared everything, storing food for long winter, using predictable migration patterns to time movement. Life here wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. It wasn't even particularly logical. But humans stayed anyway. Because humans, even then, were stubborn. The first look toward the far north. Eventually, some groups reached the northernmost edges of Asia, places where the land touches the Arctic Circle. Not permanently. Not immediately. Just seasonally, they discovered. Long nights, long days, biting Refuge, animals, massive seas of icy and landscapes that seemed endless. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinos, wild horses, and giant deer. They followed herds through frozen plains where footprints stayed frozen for months. No one lived there year-round at first. But over thousands of years, humans became capable of enduring conditions no other primate ever had. This endurance would eventually carry them across Beringia and into the Americas. But that's far ahead, right now. They're just learning how to exist on land where winter lasts half the year and summer arrives, just long enough to tease them. We're drifting deeper now into the calm sprawl of early humanity across Southeast Asia, Australia, East Asia, and the cold edges of Siberia. Nothing rushed, nothing intentional. Just the species doing what it always did best, pressing forward at the pace of weather, food, and mild curiosity. By this point in the story, humans had quietly become one of the most adaptable animals on Earth. Not the strongest, not the fastest, definitely not the most coordinated. But we were surprisingly good at staying alive in places that probably looked like nature's polite way of saying, "Please don't live here, so let's keep going." Adapting to a world of islands as sea levels shifted, the Southeast Asian landscape transformed constantly. What was once a continuous stretch of land could flood within a few centuries, turning a familiar hunting ground into a shallow sea. Humans, of course, responded in the most human way possible. They shrugged, looked around, and walked somewhere else. Some groups found themselves split by rising waters. One branch stayed on the mainland, another stuck on a newly formed island. Neither side was particularly dramatic about it. They simply adapted. On islands, humans had to pay closer attention to resources. There were fewer large animals, so fishing became more important. Toolmaking shifted toward lighter, sharper tools for gutting fish and preparing plants. Campsites were built closer to the shore, and people learned to read tides and currents the way their ancestors read grasslands. Generations living on islands developed new cultural habits, new diets, and new rhythms. They didn't know they were becoming distinct, but they were. And these quiet island communities created stepping stones that would eventually lead to one of humanity's biggest early achievements, reaching Australia. Crossing into Sahul, humanity's first real leap. Journey to the combined landmass of ancient Australia and New Guinea. Sahul remains one of the oldest seafaring feats in human history. Yet it probably didn't feel heroic at the time. A handful of families, drifting along coastlines, might have stumbled onto exposed sandbars or shallow seas during low tides. Pieces of driftwood and simple rafts could have carried them a few miles. A long storm could have pushed them farther south without asking permission. It was not a grand voyage. It was not a deliberate attempt to reach another continent. It was simply the world nudging people along. And when they arrived, they stepped onto a land unlike anything they had ever seen, the wild new world of Sahel, Australia. And New Guinea in prehistoric times were ecological museums full of creatures no African or Asian human had ever encountered: giant marsupial lions, enormous kangaroos, oversized flightless birds, reptiles the length of cars, and plants that looked innocent until touched. Everything here was strange. Everything required learning, and humans, as always, learned quietly. They adjusted their hunting techniques. They changed their tools. They figured out water routes and rainfall patterns. They practiced early fire management to shape the land, something Aboriginal Australians would later perfect into one of the most sophisticated fire systems in the world. Even their sense of time changed. In some regions, the rhythms of the land were based not on seasons, but on cycles of rain, fruiting plants, animal migrations, and the changing colors of landscapes. Humans were becoming attuned to the subtleties of the environment in ways modern people rarely experience. Meanwhile, back in Asia, more drifting while some groups settled into life in Australia. Others kept exploring the mainland, Northern Asia, especially China, offered fertile river plains and varied landscapes. Warm southern rainforest forests in central regions, cold steppes in the north, winding rivers packed with fish, mountains filled with caves, coastlines rich in shellfish, and kelp forests. Early humans adjusted to each niche like water filling the shape of a container. In warmer climates, they thrived on fruits, nuts, fish, and small game. In cooler climates, they learned to hunt deer, boar, and eventually larger mammals. Their tools changed depending on the prey. Their shelters shifted depending on rainfall and wind, and over time, their appearance, habits, and languages began to drift in different directions simply because distance makes diversity happen. Even without intention, the first steps toward Japan during periods of low sea levels. Japan was connected to the mainland by land bridges. Humans likely crossed these without fanfare. One generation saw a coastline. The next saw a path. The next walked across without thinking twice. Japan offered forests, mountains, rivers, and abundant coastlines filled with fish. Humans settled in pockets where resources were generous and danger felt manageable. They developed early seafaring instincts, not for exploration, but because coastal living eventually encourages boat building whether you mean to or not. A few logs tied with vines, a carved-out trunk, a raft reinforced with branches, simple, functional, and enough to move between river mouths and nearshore waters. These humble beginnings would eventually shape thousands of years of maritime tradition. But at this time, it was just another way to get dinner, drifting into northern Asia and Siberia again farther north. Humans were pushing deeper into colder climates. These weren't accidental wanderings anymore. They were cycles of following big prey animals like mammoths, bison, giant deer, and wild horses. Humans became seasonal migrants, not by planning, just by habit, following food because food didn't like staying in one place. Siberia demanded new problem-solving skills. Fire that lasted through long nights, windproof, shelter-shared, warmth-dependable, recuperate. Clothing tools capable of cutting through frozen hide. Mental resilience for days where sunlight barely appeared. Humans didn't become tougher in Siberia. They became smarter about surviving discomfort. And over thousands of years, these gradual adaptations allowed them to endure extreme cold, something no earlier human species had done with such versatility. The quiet spread toward the northeast edge. Some groups continued pushing north and east until they reached areas where the land thinned into an arc of frozen tundra. They were approaching a region that would eventually become the launch point for the human journey into the Americas. But that crossing won't happen for tens of thousands of years. For now, these groups were just living quietly in harsh winters, unaware that future scientists would marvel at how they managed to survive in places where even mammoths struggled. These early Siberian groups didn't think of themselves as pioneers. They were just following herds, making fire, raising children, and murmuring stories around low-burning flames through endless winter nights. We're easing now into the final stretch of this chapter. Humanity is scattered across Southeast Asia, Australia, East Asia, and Siberia like tiny beads spilled across an enormous floor, each bead far apart, each one carrying its own small habits, each unaware that it belongs to a much bigger pattern forming across tens of thousands of years. Nothing abrupt happens in this era, no leaps, just the very slow settling of people into the landscapes they wandered into. Let's settle in with them A world of small, quiet regions by this point. If you traveled across Eurasia, not that anyone would, you would see tiny human groups living in wildly different environments. A few dozen people on a warm riverbank, gathering fruit. Another small group under pine trees on a frosty plain, scraping skins. Another cooking fish on a rocky coastline. Another sleeping in a cave deep in a mountain valley. A handful tending a fire in the shadow of a volcano. And more wandering through grasslands, forests, islands, and snowy flats. No one thought of themselves as part of a huge species. They were just people, in tiny communities, trying to stretch their resources and patience through another day. This small scale of human life shaped everything, from how languages drifted to how traditions formed. The world was enormous, but everyone's world was tiny. How traditions began without anyone realizing in these small groups. Traditions weren't ceremonies or doctrines. They were routines, habits, little patterns repeated because they made life easier. Things like the way a particular group stacked wood for a ferethi, direction shelters faced during cold seasons specific, rhythm of a hunting kalhow, people soothed children when certain foods were gathered ho elders taught younger members to read the land how night fires were arranged, slept near the center for warmth, scouted at dawn, carried embers between camps. These weren't customs, they were simple survival. Strategies passed down quietly, but over thousands of years, these small differences accumulated, and eventually the world began forming gentle cultural zones. Different not in dramatic ways, but in small human ways. How people held tools, how they cooked, how they organized campfires, how they traveled, how they handled disputes, how they recognized danger. These early habits were the threads that would one day weave into much larger tapestries. But for now, they were just soft routines, the calm expansion of languages nobody in this era would have recognized. Language as something that changed. To them, sounds were just sounds. Words were just tools. Communication was just a fact of life. But as groups moved farther apart, their languages drifted just as quietly as their genes. New sounds appeared. Old sounds disappeared. Some words changed meaning. Others were invented for new plants, animals, or landscapes. Some accents thickened. Some phrases transformed. Languages split the same way human groups did. Slowly, sleepily, through long separation and gentle change. In East Asia, early languages would have sounded nothing like the ones developing in Australia or Siberia or India or the Middle East, and yet each dialect carried the same core from the ancestral African proto-language, like distant cousins, repeating the same lullaby with wildly different melodies. The deepening bond with land wherever humans stayed long enough. They developed a quiet emotional relationship with the land, not in a mystical sense, yet just in a practical, instinctive way. They knew which footsteps sounded hollow, which river bends always flow. Rocky cliffs caught the sunrise, which trees sheltered. Animals swear, the wind shifted at dusk where rain set. Hills gave safe vantage points where fire traveled quickly, where predators liked to sleep. Humans didn't study the land. They absorbed it. It became a part of their instincts. So much so that generations later, children would grow up with knowledge that seemed innate. Because it had been repeated so often, it felt like memory rather than learning. The land shaped the people, and the people shaped the land through controlled fire, trail building, and small acts that slowly defined regions. The formation of regional human varieties without realizing it. Humans were becoming more regionally distinct. In tropical climates, bodies stayed slender. Skin darkened or maintained deep tones for UV protection. Hair remained dark and thick. Diets stayed diverse and plant-heavy. In temperate climates, bodies grew broader. Faces adjusted subtly to cold and moisture differences. Seasonal diets created different metabolic rhythms. In cold climates, people adapted with higher fat diets, thicker clothing, stockier builds, strong arms from hunting large mammals, and an instinctive understanding of seasonal cycles. None of these changes were dramatic, just quiet adjustments over thousands of years. Guided by climate and lifestyle, humans weren't evolving toward anything. They were simply matching their environments. Long-distance trade before it was a thing, no. There weren't merchants wandering across continents selling seashells for mammoth fat. But humans did exchange items, just slowly, through tiny, repeated movements. A shell from a tropical beach could be carried a few miles by one group, then a few more miles by another, then gifted to someone who traveled inland. And slowly, over generations, it might reach a region hundreds of miles away. No one planned this. No one organized it. Items simply moved with people. Bones, teeth, stone tools, red ochre, seeds, unique stones, small carved objects. Ancient trade wasn't commerce. It was drift. Objects moving at the same sleepy pace as the humans carrying them. But even this random exchange helped spread ideas. Someone might see a certain type of tool and think, that's clever. Let me try something like that. And innovation spread without anyone traveling far. Early spiritual glimmers. Humans were emotional beings, long before they were spiritual beings. But emotion slowly gave birth to meaning. People began to sense patterns in nature, cycles, rhythms, events that felt larger than themselves. They didn't create religions yet, but they formed habits that carried spiritual seeds. Placing special objects with the dead, avoiding certain places that felt ominous, some animals with respect, painting bodies with ochre during meaningful events, telling stories about storms, fires, or stars gathering together to mark transitions in seasons or life stages. These weren't belief systems, just quiet gestures of wonder or caution. But from here, human spirituality would slowly grow. Gently, one whispered story at a time. A species spread thin, but spread everywhere. By now, humanity existed in scattered pockets across two vast regions, where early Australians and Papuans were carving out a life among strange animals and dramatic landscapes, and Sunderland, East Asia, and Siberia, where other groups drifted through forests, plains, coasts, and frozen valleys. There were no cities, no roads, no large tribes, just tiny constellations of humans living in their own quiet orbits. If you could view the world from above, humanity would look like a campfire glowing faintly on a riverbed, than nothing for hundreds of millennia. Another camp, than miles of untouched wilderness, than faint movement through a coastal forest, than silence again. The world was big. Humans were small, and that smallness allowed them to adapt to landscapes without overwhelming them. For now, the last quiet innovations of this era, as humans settled into their far-flung homes. Their toolkits grew modestly more specialized. Stone blades shaped for specific animal, scrapers meant for thick hide, spear points optimized for large game bone tools sharpened for cutting softer plants, fish, points crafted from shell silly attaching stone pieces to wooden handles. Nothing revolutionary, just small improvements accumulated over thousands of years, each one making life slightly less difficult. Fire became deeply embedded into daily routines. Humans weren't just using fire. They were managing it, keeping embers alive for travel-burning landscapes, deliberately clearing underbrush for hunting warming, caves and shelters through night-long, burn-smoking fish and meat for preservation. Controlled fire is one of humanity's oldest technologies, and by this point it had become second nature, an extension of daily survival, connecting to the land in different ways. Different regions shaped humans differently. In the rainforests, humans stored knowledge of edible plants and poisonous ones, and they navigated by sound, scent, and subtle changes in humidity. In the savannas, people watched animal migrations and read the landscape by tracks, wind, and grass color in cold steppes. Survival depended on timing hunts with herds and building shelters that held heat in coastal regions. People learned tides, currents, and the habits of fish and shellfish. Different landscapes required different wisdom, and each group developed a quiet expertise that their ancestors in Africa never needed. These early forms of environmental mastery were the seeds of everything future cultures would become. The subtle rise of art and expression was still primitive, but it was evolving. Groups carried ochre for body decoration. Some engraved simple lines on bone or stone, patterns without clear meaning, but clearly intentional. Some collected unusual objects, shells, animal teeth, polished stones, seeds, feathers. It wasn't art yet, not in the modern sense, but it was the beginning of the human impulse to mark meaning. Small shell worn around the neck, Matov symbolized nothing more than "I like this," or it could have meant, "My group lives by the coast," or "This reminds me of somewhere else." Expression had begun. Even if no one called it that, the first true sense of home as groups stayed generations in the same valleys, coasts, and forests. Something new and quiet began forming. A sense of belonging. People knew the best berry patch hidden, freshwater spring, warm rock ledge at Sunset Ridge, where deer crossed cave that always kept the wind out, riverbend where fish were easiest to catch. These tiny landscapes became emotional anchors, not ownership, just familiarity, comfort in a world where most things were uncertain. After tens of thousands of years of wandering, early humans were beginning to settle, not in permanent villages, but in recurring seasonal rounds that created the earliest sense of our place. It wasn't agriculture, it wasn't settlement, but it was the foundation both would eventually rest on, the edges of the next great journey. By the end of this era, humans were standing near the thresholds of future expansions. In Southeast Asia, island-hopping routes would eventually lead deeper into the Pacific and Siberia. Humans were learning to survive cold enough to approach the Bering Land, bridging South Asia and China. Populations were growing slowly and beginning to shape tool traditions that would later develop into distinct cultural lineages in Australia. People were creating some of the oldest continuous cultural patterns the world would ever see, and across Africa. Other groups were continuing their own paths, still innovating, still expanding, still forming the genetic core of all humankind. Humanity was no longer close to extinction. It was quietly thriving, scattered but resilient, small in number, but vast in adaptability. Everything to come, Europe, the Pacific, the Americas, civilization would grow from these sleepy, slow, patient steps. Tonight, we're following early humans as they wander into a region that, frankly, didn't roll out the welcome mat. We're talking Ice Age Europe, home of cold winds, giant animals, and Neanderthals who had already been living there for hundreds of thousands of years and probably sighed heavily every time distant cousins from the south wandered in again. This part of the story is chilly, slow, and full of small human adjustments that eventually led to some of the most significant changes in our species' history. No kingdoms yet, no emperors, just people with cold hands and stubborn determination. Let's drift in the edge of Europe. The first glimpse of the West be the time. Homo sapiens approached the regions that today formed the Middle East and Southeastern Europe. They were used to diverse climates. They'd handled tropical forests, monsoons, dry plains, and freezing Siberian winds. But Europe was another challenge entirely. Most of the continent was locked in a long ice age cycle. Glaciers covered huge regions. Winters were brutal. Summers were short and mild. Animals were enormous and slightly annoyed by everything. And Neanderthals were everywhere. So when early humans reached these lands, they were cautious. Imagine a small group emerging from a sheltered valley and staring at a wide, cold plain. The wind hits them like a rude handshake. Someone quietly wonders if turning back would be the smart choice. But food doesn't negotiate, and herds moved into these colder regions. So humans followed, slowly, carefully, one valley at a time, meeting Neanderthals again. But this time on their home turf. We've seen Homo sapiens meet Neanderthals before in the Middle East, but Europe was different. Neanderthals owned this landscape. Not literally, they weren't signing leases, but they understood Europe in ways. Homo sapiens, DIDN, single quotes, T, Neanderthals, knew every migration route, tracked giant game, effortless caves with expert skill bull shelters that resisted freezing, winds wore heavy hides adapted for cold navigation. Forests and plains with deep familiarity weren't just residents. They were specialists. Homo sapiens walked into their territory like slightly lost cousins, arriving late to a family reunion they weren't invited to. And yet, there wasn't a war. The two species coexisted, sometimes at a distance, sometimes interacting, sometimes merging socially and genetically. The idea that Neanderthals were brutes is long outdated. They were intelligent, social, skilled, emotionally complex. If anything, Homo sapiens probably learned a few survival tricks from them, quietly observing and adapting, the new toolkit for a new climate Europe forced early humans to adjust their tools in ways they never had before. In warmer climates, a simple sharp flake worked fine. But in cold regions, you needed more, sturdier to hunt enormous animal scrapers designed for thick hidesbone needles, for stitching heavy clothing, composite tools with multiple materials, kits that worked in freezing windsweeping, shafts that could endure cold snaps without snapping. These upgrades happened slowly. A few mistakes, a few improvements, a few experiments by someone who probably got tired of freezing fingers and decided to reinvent something. Innovation wasn't sudden, it was practical. One tiny improvement at a time. Europe's cold didn't inspire creative genius. It just made complaining until innovation happened a survival strategy. New animals, New strategized European wildlife during the Ice Age looked like a mixture of a nature documentary and a fantasy novel. There were mammoths, Rhinish dent elklians, larger than modern lions, cave bears that were absolutely too big, hyenas adapted to cold wild, horses, bazined reindeer. Everywhere hunting strategies had to adapt. These animals were huge, mobile, and well protected by thick hides and wide horns. Humans learned to hunt cooperatively, set traps and funnel herds, track animals over snowy ground, use spears with better leveragetto, plan hunts around migration patterns, take advantage of cliffs, rivers, and terrain. The cooperation required for big game hunting deepened social bonds. It wasn't glamorous, just necessary. A single mammoth hunt could feed a group for weeks, but getting it wrong meant everyone went hungry. Life here was quiet but demanding. People had to pay attention to everything: the wind, the snow, the animals, each other, shelters. The first real craft of the North, early humans in Europe, developed shelters more elaborate than anything they'd needed before. Some lived in caves, but not all caves were suitable. Many were too cold, too damp, or too dark, so they built hide frames, bone supported, structure small stone, windbreaks deep, shelters insulated with soil teepee-like frameworks, draped with hides. Long-term winter camps along riverbanks. Say, good shelter meant survival. A poor shelter meant misery. And humans, being human, slowly optimized. A little more insulation, a better angle against the wind, a more efficient hearth, a layout that kept sleeping areas warmer. This wasn't architecture. It was problem-solving, born from people who were tired of shivering. Seasonal rounds become tradition. Europe's seasons were sharp and demanding. Humans couldn't just wander randomly. They needed predictable cycles. So seasonal rounds formed. Summer hunting grounds, autumn gathering areas, winter shelter, spring migration paths. These cycles became traditions long before the concept of tradition existed. Children learned them instinctively. Adults remembered paths passed down from their grandparents. Stories formed around places, not sacred stories yet, but practical ones. This valley has water even in dry times. Animals pass here when the snow melts. Firewood is good near the ridge. Don't camp on that plain. The wind hates you there. Over time, this knowledge mapped Europe long before any map existed. The first whisper of art in Europe became one of the earliest hubs of symbolic expression. Not at first, not immediately, but slowly the pressures of cold, darkness, and long winters created moments of creativity. Humans began engraving bones with lines and patterns, carving small figurines, symbols into cave walls, collecting pigments like charcoal and ochre, decorating bodies with simple markings, originating objects in meaningful ways. Nothing dramatic, yet the famous cave art was still in the future, but the spark was there. Long nights, quiet shelters, crackling fires, and minds that wandered even when bodies were stuck indoors. Humans were becoming thinkers as much as survivors. The Neanderthal declined quiet and slow. As Homo sapiens grew more adaptable and spread more deeply into Europe, Neanderthal populations began to shrink, not because of battles, not because of conquest, mostly because of two quiet forces: climate changes that disrupted their specialized hunting, pattern competition with a species that adapted faster to new conditions. There were likely peaceful interactions, exchanges, shared shelters, shared knowledge, and yes, shared genes. But over thousands of years, Homo sapiens spread further, faster. Neanderthal groups dwindled, isolated in small pockets that eventually faded. It wasn't a dramatic extinction. It was a slow fading of one human species as another, more flexible, more numerous, filled the landscape, a quiet passing, not a war. A continent that forced humans to grow up Europe didn't allow laziness. It didn't let people drift through life comfortably. The cold, the seasons, the terrain, they demanded attention. Every day required choices. Conserve heat, find food. Maintain tools, patch clothing, predict weather manage. Fire, track, herd, stay, together support. The young and the elderly people couldn't just wander aimlessly anymore. They needed routines, plans, rhythms, and slowly, without noticing, they began forming the earliest structured ways of life. Nothing formal, nothing written, just patterns that repeated across generations. Shaping thought and behavior, the harshness of the land became part of the human mind. The first, social structures, worth commenting, uneven within tiny groups. Social dynamics were shifting. Cold climates demanded cooperation more urgently than warm ones ever did. A single mistake could cost everyone, so people relied on each other in deeper ways. Skilled hunters teaching younger men, passing down navigation, knowing exactly where plants hid under snow, splitting lost meat, taking turns tending fire, shared responsibility for children, collective decisions for seasonal movement. Leadership existed, but gently, not authoritarian, more like guidance from the most experienced. No crowns, no symbols of power, just respect earned through quiet competence. These early social structures are the first hints of human organization. Small, subtle, practical, the roots of everything that would one day become societies, clans, tribes, and eventually kingdoms. But for now, it was all simple, almost invisible. The slow rise of symbolic thinking. Cold winters meant long nights. Long nights meant time. Time meant thinking. And thinking eventually turned into creativity. The first artwork in Europe wasn't necessarily meant to be art. It may have been storytelling, keeping, seasonal marking, attempts to teach ways to express gratitude or fear, burden management during storms, small carvings, simple pigments on stone, patterns scratched into bone, symbols repeated for reasons the makers didn't explain. These weren't masterpieces yet, just quiet expression. But from this spark, the great cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet would eventually form, still thousands of years in the future. Symbolic thought was here, growing, taking shape in the minds of people who still struggled daily to keep warm. Humans begin to see themselves as something more European, life-forced, a new level of awareness. People saw themselves as part of cycles bigger than their individual lives. Seasonal hunts, animal migrations, fire, ritual, short story, traditions repeated over and over, gatherings during winter rites for the dead. Nothing formal, nothing written, but early humans were beginning to sense continuity, to see themselves as part of a long thread of time. Even if they didn't have the language to describe it, they felt it. A sense of we'd been here before, a sense of our people do this, a sense of belonging that stretched beyond the immediate moment. This was the quiet beginning of identity. Not personal identity, not cultural identity, but something between the two. A recognition that a group had a shared story. Europe begins to feel familiar. After thousands of years in Europe, humans weren't newcomers anymore. They were residents. They knew which valleys warmed early itch. Plains stayed icy where rivers froze, lass where bison gathered which, caves sheltered, wind where flint lay beneath the soil where mammoths passed. Each season their maps lived in their minds. Their instincts shaped their days. Their tools matched the land. Their children grew up fully adapted to the cold. The snow, the long nights. Europe wasn't easy. But it was home, and being able to call a harsh place home is one of humanity's greatest skills. Neanderthals fade from the pictures. Homo sapiens became more numerous and adaptable. Neanderthals, who had ruled these lands for ages, began disappearing. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow. Pockets thinning, territories shrinking, small groups merging with Homo sapiens. Others simply fading away. Climate shifts hit them hard. Changing prey hit them harder. Smaller populations meant fewer chances for long-term survival. Their final centuries were quiet, a gradual dimming of a species that had thrived for hundreds of millennia. They didn't vanish in a dramatic final battle. They simply slipped out of the world, leaving behind tools, bones, genes, and a mystery that modern humans still unravel. Their end marks one of the major turning points of human prehistory, an entire branch of humanity leaving the stage. We're now entering the era when humans began shaping Europe in a way that would leave traces thousands of years later, through art, tools, rituals, and a kind of emotional depth that earlier ages only hinted at. Let's ease in. Europe becomes a patchwork of human worlds by this time. Humans weren't just surviving in Europe. They were spreading into different regions that each had their own character. Western Europe, limestone caves, rolling plains, big rivers, and forests full of game. Central Europe, dense woods, colder winters, heavy snows, and lots of large mammals. Northern Europe, still mostly but summer thaws created lush meadows that animals couldn't resist. Southern Europe, milder climates, sheltered valleys, and coastlines where shellfish made for easy meals. Each group adapted to its surroundings in quiet, practical ways. And the longer they stayed in these places, the more each area began developing its own style of life. Not culture in the modern sense, just slightly different routines, different hunting techniquest, fawned tools different, shelter layouts different, seasonal movements different, ways of decorating their bow dies different, ways of telling stories. Europe was becoming a mosaic. Even though no one knew the word yet, the cold reshapes human life. Again I say Europe wasn't consistently frozen. The climate swung back and forth like a slow and decisive pendulum. Some centuries were warmer, with thick forests expanding north. Other centuries plunged into deep cold, glaciers growing, rivers freezing, forests dying back. Humans had to adjust constantly, shifting campsites, tracking new migration paths, learning where prey retreated during the coldest months, changing clothing. Traditions moving deeper into caves during harsh spells, emerging into open plains during warm periods. Life in Europe wasn't a struggle, it was a negotiation. Humans didn't fight nature. They adjusted to it with the patience of people who knew the world wasn't going to bend for them. Every shift, every season, taught them something new. The artistic awakening begins. This is the era when humans finally began doing something that would echo through millennia. They started making art, and not just lines or scratches, not simple patterns, not the early symbolic marks of Part 5, actual art, cave art, handprints, animal figures, abstract shapes, herds in motion, symbols repeated across generations. This wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration. It grew slowly, almost shyly, like someone dipping their toe into creativity and realizing it felt nice. The earliest European art appears in small forms of carved bone with tiny geometric patterns, a piece of ochre rubbed smooth from Uasia, figurine with exaggerated feature as a stone with deliberate groove-shand stencils decorating cave wall attempts to depict animals they saw daily. These weren't masterpieces yet, but they were unmistakably intentional. Humans were no longer just surviving. They were expressing, quietly, calmly, with no idea future generations would stare at their walls in awe. Caves become human story. Spaces. Europe's caves weren't just shelters. They became something else, something almost ceremonial, not religious, exactly, not sacred in a formal sense, but meaningful. Humans used caves for shelter during storms, territory coming of age, ritual snoring, the dead teaching younger members about animals. Caves were warm in winter, cool in summer, a constant in a changing world. And because some of these caves were deep and dark, humans had to bring fire inside. This changed everything. Firelight flickered across cave walls, transforming art into movement. Painted bison seemed to run horses, looked like they were breathing. Handprints glowed red and orange. Abstract symbols pulsed under the flames. Imagine sitting in that darkness, fire crackling, shadows dancing, and hearing someone softly explain the meaning of a painted shape. This was the beginning of human imagination flourishing, not loudly, not dramatically, just naturally. The Venus figurines, quiet icons of their world around this time. Humans began carving small figurines, rounded, exaggerated depictions of the human form, often female. Archaeologists call them Venus figurines, even though the people who made them had no concept of Venus or Roman anything. These figurines were small enough to carry us, moved by handling, carved from bone, stone, or ivory, shaped with gentle curve, sometimes detailed with hair or patterns, usually faceless. Focusing on the body instead, scholars still debate their meaning. Fertility, comfort, identity, luck, education. But one thing is clear, they mattered. People made them carefully, carried them, treasured them. This was art tied to emotion, not survival. A quiet glimpse into how humans felt about themselves, and it's one of the earliest signs of symbolic thought, deepening into something personal. The first musical notes in the dark. Another quiet milestone appears in this era. Music. Humans began crafting flutes from bird bones and mammoth ivory. Simple instruments with soft tones that echoed beautifully in caves. Picture a cold evening, a fire burning low, and someone playing a slow, wandering tune on a bone flute. Not a performance, just a moment of comfort. Music didn't appear because someone wanted entertainment. It appeared because humans needed expression in a world that often felt harsh and huge. This era marks the beginning of rhythm and melody in human life. Social life gains. Depth in the cold climates forced humans to spend more time indoors or in sheltered spaces. That led to deeper social bonds. People shared longer conversations, covey tasks, storytelling sessions, multifamily gatherings, teaching, mentored food, story shared, fire shared dreams, and fear shared traditions. Cooperation wasn't optional. It was survival. And in this close living came stronger identity, stronger group cohesion, and the beginnings of something that feels like culture. Tiny groups, maybe 20 to 40 people, became emotional worlds of their own. The slow spread into Western and Northern Europe as Europe warmed during certain cycles. Humans moved farther west and north. Southern France became a hotspot of activity. So did Spain, Italy, the Balkans, southern Germany. Eventually pockets of northern Europe when climates allowed. Each region created its own rhythm. Different cave traditions, different tool styles, different hunting strategies different. Artistic habits different. Myths and stories whispered by firelight Europe was becoming a tapestry. Not just of landscapes, but of human lifeways. And all of it was still soft. Slow, barely noticeable in real time. The deep rhythm of Europe's seasons. Living in Ice Age Europe meant living with rhythm. The land demanded it, and humans followed. Every year had a predictable pattern. Long winters with heavy wind-short springs with melting snow brief. Summers full of movement crisp. Autumns for gathering and preparation. People didn't talk about seasons the way we do. They felt them. The first morning, the cold eased. Smell of thawing ground, return of migratory animals, shift in bird-coursed way, daylight stretched against. Moment plants poked through melting soil. Life was shaped by these cues. Everything else, art, stories, rituals, fit around them. This slow, cyclical living taught humans patience. It taught them consistency. It taught them to expect change without forcing it. Europe shaped their minds, the same way the savannas shaped their ancestors. Firelight, the heart of Ice Age life in this cold world. Fire was more than a tool. It was the center of everything. Fire kept people warm, kept predators back, cooked food, dried hides, hardened tools, lit caves, smoked meat for storage, gave comfort during endless winter nights, but it also became emotional. People gathered around it every evening, not because of ritual, but because there was nowhere else to be around fire. Humans shared stories taught. Children retold migration. Routes passed on knowledge planned, hunts lord quietly. Tools decorated, Bodis whispered. Fierce mourned, the dead celebrated, births fire made. Community possible in a world that often felt too large and too cold. It wasn't sacred. It was simply everything. Art grows deeper. Slowly and quietly, European art didn't explode suddenly. It deepened over thousands of years. What started as lines and handprints eventually grew into detailed and the mouse figures, showing motion-layered outlines Hayden, created by natural rock conceivable, repeated across distant regions. More carved, statuesque, sculptured compositions, simple narrative scenes. People weren't trying to make masterpieces. They were trying to explain their world, trying to describe animals they hunted, trying to teach younger group members, trying to mark something meaningful, trying to pass time during long, dark winters. Their art was calm, thoughtful, unrushed. It echoed the pace of their lives. Rituals take their first soft shape. This era is when humans began forming behaviors that were more than routines and not quite full traditions. Rituals weren't dramatic. A gesture before a hunter, chant or hum at sunset, shared silence at the start of winter, bodies painted with ochre. For certain, even careful placement of stones or tool-specific ways of honoring them. Dead storytelling sessions that happened in the same spot every night, nothing codified. Nothing formal, just comforting repetition. These tiny rituals tied groups together. They built a sense of continuity, something that stretched backward and forward through generations. The emotional landscape of humanity was deepening. Life expands. But gently by this point, humans were spreading into new corners of Europe. Places once too cold, now warming in small cycles. They discovered new valleys with rich river territories filled with reindeer-sheltered forests ideal for winter. Campshe cliffs perfect for lookout. Points coastlines with endless shellfish-land plains perfect for seasonal gatherings. Some groups began returning to the same locations year after year. These places weren't settlements, but seasonal homes. Certain caves became gathering points across generations. Certain cliffs became hunting stations families recognized. Certain clearings became warm season hubs. The beginnings of place-based memory were forming. Humans were slowly turning landscapes into familiar maps. The emotional weight of time, something subtle, was happening inside human minds during this era. They were becoming aware of time, not just seasons, but lineage. They understood. Ancestors had been hero children, would follow marries, could be passed along stories. Matrodobics could hold meaning events, could echo across lifetimes. This wasn't philosophy. It wasn't religion. It was just a growing awareness that human life was bigger than a single generation. It's one of the first signs that humans were developing a deeper emotional consciousness, something richer than instinct and more personal than simple routine. Time wasn't just a cycle. It was a thread. This chapter is all about what happens when Europe begins to thaw. Slowly, unevenly, grudgingly, like someone turning up the heat in a drafty house. Humans adapt, animals shift, forests creep north, and entire regions open up for the first time in tens of thousands of years. Let's drift into it. Europe begins to warm, but not politely around this time. The climate starts doing something unusual. It tries to get warmer. Not tropical warm, obviously, just less horrifying. Imagine a winter that's still cold, but doesn't feel like it's trying to personally offend you. Summers that stretch a little longer. Forests returning to areas that used to be flat, icy wastelands. Rains coming more regularly. Rivers thawing earlier. This wasn't a steady warm-up. It was more like warm, decadeckled, century warm, centuricidin, storm cycle sana, cold snap breath, heat wave back to colder up, was basically in climate indecision mode. But humans took advantage of every warm period. No matter how short, where the land opened, they followed. Forests begin creeping. North forests are slow walkers, but when temperatures rose, they moved. Trees expanded into empty lands, bringing birds, small mammals, and new plant life with them. Humans welcomed this because forests meant firewood shelter dell, plants more, game better camouflage for hunting shaded summer camps familiar. Gathering cycles, reindeer and mammoths slowly retreated north. Humans followed them in some cases, but many stayed with the forests instead, because living among trees felt a lot nicer than living on a wind-blasted plain where the breeze could remove your soul. This shift created two kinds of European humans: forest specialists, open plain hunters. Both groups adapted differently and developed slightly different lifestyles. Open plains hunters, the last mammoth people. As Europe warmed, mammoths began retreating into the far north, the last cold strips of the continent. but some humans followed them. These were the people who kept the old Ice Age ways alive. Long-range hunting, tracking migration patterns, living in windswept shelters, managing huge hide-scarving tools from bone and ivory, timing movement with herd cycles there. Camps were usually set up near ridges, riverbanks, or sparse forests where they could watch herds from a distance. These people had patience and thick clothing and a mental relationship with cold that most of us would not survive. But even these mammoth hunters were running out of Ice Age time. The warming world was shrinking their hunting zones. They didn't know it yet, but they were the last generation of true mammoth trackers, forest gatherers, the new way of life. Meanwhile, humans in the warming southern and central regions embraced the return of trees like they'd been missing an old friend. Forests offered berries in summer, nuts in autumn, roots that were smaller but easier to hunt wood for, tools, bark for binding natural shelters in hollow trees or dense groves, blunt fibers for rope and weaving. Life here became more varied. People didn't rely on a single giant animal. They relied on dozens of small ones and a full buffet of plants. This created more stable food source, similar territories for long migrations, more time for crafting, more social gatherings, more predictable routines. You can almost imagine groups relaxing just a little bit, still working, still hunting, still gathering, but with slightly less panic energy. The return of rivers and lakes as the ice melted, lakes expanded, and rivers swelled. Some regions flooded, others filled with new fish. Humans adapted instantly because if there's one thing we love, it's convenient water sources. Riverbanks became campsites. Lakes became gathering zones. Fishing became a bigger part of survival. Tools shifted to bone points for spearing, fish nets made from plant fiber, sharpened sticks hardened by fire, small hooks, baskets for trapping fish in shallow waters. Water meant predictability. Predictability meant calmer days and less wandering. For the first time in European history, some groups had the luxury of staying put for longer stretches, not settled, but less nomadic than before. Seasonal living became more structured. Art enters its golden moment as life stabilized a bit. Art got bolder. Cave walls that once held simple drawings now displayed complex hunting, senna-slayed, shading, overlapping, animal composition, slants that suggested motion, shapes, possibly early counting Marxian prints arranged in patterns, figures that seemed almost narrative. People spent serious time on these works. Firelight probably flickered across their paintings while someone explained why a certain shape mattered or what a certain animal meant. This wasn't just decoration. It was knowledge sharing, memory keeping, community-building. And it hints that humans were now thinking in more abstract ways, seeing themselves as part of a story worth telling. Gatherings grow larger. Warmer climates allowed larger groups to meet seasonally. Not huge crowds, maybe 50, maybe 100 in rare cases. But in a world where groups were usually the size of extended families, this felt enormous. These gatherings weren't festivals. They were mating networks, trade, exchange, storytell, opportunities, smooth swaps, opportunities for alliance, for young people to not marry their cousins. For once, these gatherings created broader social networks, news, traveler traditions, mingled languages, blended tool techniques, spreaded styles, moved from region to region. Europe was beginning to feel connected, not in a political sense, but in a human sense. People were aware of others, of other camps, other valleys, other groups who lived over the ridge or beyond the river. This was the beginning of continental communication. The emotional life of early Europeans grows. Richer humans weren't just surviving anymore. They were experiencing things deeply. Grief that lasted, joy that echoed through groups mori, that spanned generations. Pride, hope, curiosity about the sky bonds between familiar's long-term attachment to land. They laughed. They teased. They told stories. They comforted each other. They planned ahead. They sang. They argued. They mourned. All the emotional complexity we think of as modern human behavior was right here in these small European groups. Just quieter, simpler, not wrapped in culture or ceremony. Just human. The final cooling and the last push north toward the end of this warming era. The climate dipped again. One more cold gasp from the Ice Age before its long retreat. Forests held firm in southern regions, but northern lands opened up under new cold winds, creating rich grasslands. Humans entered these areas slowly, testing them like you test bathwater with one toe. They discovered migrating reindeersmaller herds of mammoths, thick-furred horseshoes, northern river-supine plains, ideal for long hunches, perfect for tracking prey across miles. Human footprints spread into what is now Belgium, Germany, Poland, and eventually parts of Scandinavia. When conditions allowed, Europe was filling in. Still lightly, still sparsely, but more evenly than ever before. The last glow of the Ice Age traditions as Europe warmed and cooled in messy cycles. Humans who had lived through the harshest Ice Age conditions carried older traditions with them. These included coordinated group hunts, deep knowledge of cold weather, animal stick knocks for sewing thick hides, bone and ivory carving, long-term winter shelters, fire management, style storytelling tied to the rhythms of winter. These traditions didn't disappear when the climate improved. They softened. They adapted. They lingered as echoes of the older world. You can imagine an older hunter teaching a younger one to track reindeer over frozen ground, even if the freeze wasn't nearly as deep as it used to be. Old habits survive long after the environment changes, and these old habits became part of the cultural inheritance of the new Europe. The dawn of regional identities, still tiny, still subtle. Europe was now filled with humans who had lived there long enough that different regions were developing distinct flavors, not cultures in the full sense, but styles of living that reflected local conditions. In Western Europe, groups favored cave-rich regions, developing a deep tradition of cave painting and symbolic expression. In Central Europe, dense forests encouraged smaller, more flexible hunting strategies, and more emphasis on plant gathering. In northern plains, humans followed the last reindeer herds with nearly year-round migrations. Along coasts, shellfish and fish became stable food sources, leading to quieter lives and more predictable routines. These differences weren't obvious to them, but from the outside, you can see Europe slowly fracturing into lifestyle zones, shaped by climate and terrain, tiny seeds of diversity that would matter thousands of years later. Art reaches a new confidence by the end of this era. European art wasn't just emerging anymore. It was maturing. People were now creating cave paintings with layered pigment, scarved objects with meaning beyond, decorational sequences of simple cinematic figures with remarkable accuracy, portable art objects that traveled with groups, engraved stones marking significant place, abstract shapes that hint at shared meaning. Firelight played across these works, animating them in flickering waves. It's easy to imagine the effect on the people who viewed them. Calming, comforting, mysterious, beautiful, important art wasn't entertainment. It was communication across time. It showed what mattered, what they feared, what they admired, what they depended on, what they dreamed of. This growing artistic world is one of the clearest signs that Ice Age Europeans were becoming emotionally complex in ways that feel deeply familiar to us today. Humans begin looking beyond survival. Life in Europe had always been hard, but predictable hard. Unpredictability gave people space to think. They started noticing beauty in the world. They started assigning meaning to places. They started telling stories about landscapes, animals, and ancestors. They began to feel connections across time. To the people who lived before Themto, the people who would live after Themto, the land itself To, the rhythms of Naturato, the symbols painted on cave walls To memories, carried across generations. This wasn't religion. It wasn't culture. It was the emotional scaffolding from which both would later grow. Humans were becoming more than survivors. They were becoming reflectors, beings who not only acted, but interpreted. Climate turns one last time toward the end of this era. Europe entered a final cooling phase before the big warm-up that would reshape the continent entirely. Glaciers extended again, though not as far. Cold winds returned. Forests paused their northward spread. Large animals regrouped into smaller, more manageable patterns. Humans responded, as always. Shifting camps, tightening social bonds, two reliable valley-seeking caves for winter-following herds. More carefully conserving resource, waiting out the cold with practiced patiences, was the last breath of the old Ice Age Europe. The world of mammoths, reindeer highways, sprawling plains, and cavelit nights, and humans had mastered it. Tonight, we're easing into a very gentle turning point in human prehistory. The Ice Age, after tens of thousands of years of mood swings, is finally beginning its long retreat. Not fast, not clean. More like someone slowly turning down an air conditioner that's been running way too high for way too long. The glaciers melt in slow motion. Rivers swell. Forests stretch north, like they've been waiting impatiently for their cue. Animal migrations shift again. And humans begin to fill lands that were previously nothing but frozen silence. This is a chapter of openings. New landscapes, new opportunities, and new rhythms of life. Let's drift in. The first real warmth in generations, at the beginning of this era. The temperature creeps upward in a way that makes every living thing pay attention. Snow melts earlier. Ice breaks sooner. Plants sprout where none sprouted before. Birdsong returns to valleys that haven't heard it in centuries. Small mammals come back, and water fills basins that used to be hard as stone. For humans, this must have felt almost suspicious, like the world was preparing a prank. But the warmth stayed. Not perfectly, there were relapses, but enough for families to settle in places that were previously uninhabitable. People didn't celebrate. They simply adapted, the same way they always did. Forests spread like quiet green waves. With warmth came forests. Sometimes fast, sometimes creeping. Always dramatic when you zoom out thousands of years. Trees filled valleys. Birch, pine, spruce at first. Then, slowly, oaks and hazel and other leafy species when temperatures allowed. Forests brought deerwild, or bevis-birdable plants bark, for weaving wood, for tool shedder. More predictable living conditions. Open plains didn't disappear, but they shrank. And the world that was once dominated by mammoths now became a woodland world where smaller, quicker animals thrived. Humans adjusted instantly, because tracking a boar is way easier than trying to convince a mammoth to hold still. Mammoths and old Ice Age giants fade into memory as forests grew. Mammoths retreated north, then farther north, and eventually onto small refuges where food was scarce, mates were scarce, and survival became a losing game by this era. Mammoths were still around, but barely. Their world was shrinking every century. Humans who had once depended on them now shifted to new prey. Derailed boar-smeller herd mouse fish, wharton, more diverse plant foods, the old Ice Age lifestyle. Huge hunts, huge hides, huge risks became rarer and rarer. It was the end of an era, though no one living then knew it. To them, the world was simply changing again, the same way it always did. Rivers and lakes shaped new human paths. Melting ice filled Europe with water. Lots of it. Massive rivers carved deeper valleys. Lakes expanded into wide basins. Some became seasonal, some became permanent. Floodplains grew rich with new life. Humans followed these waterways naturally, setting up camps along riverbanks, in shallow delta crafting boats or rafts out of necessity, farther without long hikes, establishing seasonal routes based on water. Levels rivers became Europe's new highways, slow, winding, deeply reliable, and water brought people together in ways that dry plains never had. Woodworking takes off before this warming era. Wood wasn't useless, but with fewer trees. Bone and stone dominated toolmaking. Now, wood was everywhere. Humans learned to shape it into spear shafts, digging, sticks bowl simple, paddle stent frames fish, traps woven baskets. Hardened with resin hookshin land, eventually simple boats woodworking didn't suddenly leap into advanced carpentry. This is still prehistory. But the craft began here, quietly. Someone shaped a stick more carefully. Someone else carved a deeper groove. Someone realized curved wood had special uses. Someone learned to hollow out logs with fire and scraping, 1,000 small steps. No rush, no blueprints, just people solving problems. The new hunters of the warming world forests changed, hunting forever. Tracking. Deer in the woods required movement, treading, animal paths, moving with wind. Direction to direction, seasonal coordination in tighter space is spears evolved. Otlot spear throwers emerged in some regions. Lightweight projectiles replaced heavier Ice Age weapons. Hunting became strategic, almost elegant compared to the brute force needed for mammoth hunts. Humans also broadened their palate. Birds, fish, squirrelacées, various nuts, ruchums, hopefully the right ones. This dietary diversity created more stable survival. Less dependence on a single species meant fewer catastrophic shortages. Gathering becomes an art form with forests, cane plants, lots of them. Not random weeds, but useful, edible, predictable plants humans came to rely on. People learned. When certain berries, nuts stored wellwick roots tasted descent, leaves healed woundshich bark could be boiled witch mushrooms, were safe how to dry food for winter how to store nuts without attracting animal swear, wild fruit. Trees grewed where hazels dropped the best. Nuts gathering became a skilled role, often dominated by the most knowledgeable members, usually older women who knew the land as intimately as their own hands. These quiet experts, kept groups alive as the climate changed. Their knowledge wasn't written. It was lived, taught, repeated, passed down with the soft authority of experience. Camps become more permanent, but not settled with more predictable resources. Humans didn't need to migrate constantly. They established seasonal base camps, summer fishing, camps autumn nut gathering, camps winter, shelters in caves or dense forced spring camps, near waterfowl breeding grounds. These weren't villages. Not yet, but they were recurring places, familiar, reliable, emotionally significant. Children were born in the same caves their parents had used. Elders died in the same valleys they had known since youth. Stories developed around certain cliffs, springs, and groves. This was humanity's first hint of place-based identity, not ownership, just familiarity, comfort, belonging. Population slowly increases, you still wouldn't see crowds. Europe wasn't bustling. 1,000 people could populate a region the size of a modern country, but warmer climates meant higher birth rates, lower death rates, better infant survival, fewer starvation, events more stable, familiars more robust social groups. Population ticked upward, gently from dozens in a valley to maybe 100. From one tiny band to interconnected networks across a region. Europe was still empty by modern standards. But humans were spreading, softly and steadily. The first true networks of information as population increased. Seasonal gatherings grew larger now. Instead of meeting a few other families, groups might meet dozens of others at predictable times. Near major rivers, along large lakes and cliff overhangs, in shallow coastal zones, in open plains rich with game. These gatherings allowed tool techniques to spread stories, to evolve a symbolic marks, to be shared marriages across groups, alliances, to form migrations, to be coordinated, to be exchanged art styles, to diffusing adages to blend. Europe was still fragmented, but now connected by soft social pathways, simple networks. Nothing complex. Just people passing information by word of mouth and gesture. But this was the beginning of Europe as a shared human space. Tonight we're wandering into the gentle morning of Europe's post-Ice Age world. The glaciers are finally pulling back for real this time. Like a guest who's overstayed their welcome, muttered an apology and started walking toward the door very, very slowly. As the ice retreats, new lands appear. Forests bloom. Animals change their habits. Rivers carve fresh paths. And humans, well, humans do what they always do. Quietly adapt without giving themselves any credit. This is the phase where prehistoric Europe becomes rich. Green, full of life, full of options. No civilizations yet. Just small groups making the most of a world that suddenly feels a little less hostile. Less drift in. Europe opens its eyes with the ice withdrawing. Enormous areas that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years suddenly become usable land again. Not instantly. This is still nature, not a renovation show. But gradually, tundra turns to grasslands, turn to shrublands, turn to early forest rivers, weave new channel slakes, form in giant glacial depressions. Fresh wetlands appear everywhere. This created a kind of ecological boom. Quiet, slow, but very real. Humans watched these changes carefully. Not scientifically, but instinctively. They understood that food follows plants, and people follow food every year. The world felt just a little wider. New animals replaced the old ice age. Cast with warmer climates came animals perfectly suited for this new world. Deer were everywhere. They multiplied like they'd been waiting for the whole continent to defrost. Boar spread into forests and made the mistake of being both large and delicious. Aurochs, giant wild cattle, wandered through open meadows like they owned the place. Beavers dammed rivers. Elk roamed northern regions. Birds of every kind filled the skies. Fish thrived in newly thawed waterways. Bears wandered forest edges. Wolves followed human camps with quiet interest. It was a busy, lively continent, and humans were now surrounded by options. No more reliance on one giant species. Food was everywhere if you knew how to find it, which, of course, they did. Europe's first real human landscapes as the land changed. Humans began forming deeper relationships with the places they returned to every year. Certain valleys became favorite wintering spots. Certain rivers became summer fishing zones. Certain hills became lookout points. Certain forests became gathering grounds. Certain caves remained sacred storytelling places. These weren't territories yet. No borders. No ownership. Just familiarity. People knew paths tucked between hills. They recognized the shapes of distant ridges. They remembered where the best nut trees grew. They passed knowledge to children. This clearing was your grandmother's gathering place. This river bend never runs dry. This hill shows the herd's direction. Land wasn't just a resource. It was a memory. Tools take a quiet leap forward. With new environments came new tools. Stone tools became smaller, sharper, and more specialized. Bone and antler tools became more common. Woodworking flourished. Plant fibers got used for everything from baskets to traps. People developed. Microliths, tiny stone blades, used like puzzle pieces. Composite tools with wood, resin, and stone-lighted projectiles for smaller preyfish acropolians. Nets digging sticks for roots-woven container simple shelters framed with wood, nothing flashy. Just practical evolution. Each tool was the result of countless small adjustments. Little improvements made because someone grew tired of a frustrating design and quietly fixed it. Innovation didn't come from genius. It came from inconvenience. Cooking becomes, well, actual cooking with more diverse food sources. Cooking took on new meaning. People roasted, smoked, dried, boiled in hide-lined pits with hot stones, and experimented with plant combinations. They discovered which roots softened after long cooking. Berries were edible only when ripe. Nuts needed roasting, which herbs added flavor, which leaves healed stomach achisho to preserve fish for winter, how to store nuts without mold, to smoke meat to last for months. Cooking wasn't a craft yet, just survival with better flavor. But these early culinary habits laid the foundation for every cooking tradition Europe would eventually create. Homes become more like homes with less need for constant movement. Humans began building sturdier shelters, still temporary, still seasonal, but more comfortable. Common features included strong wooden frames, woven walls strengthened, with clay-hide roofs, fire pits placed with intention, storage pits for food, simple sleeping, areas windbreaks made from brush or log, summer shelters near water, winter shelters in forest. Depressions, these weren't villages, but they were consistent, and consistency builds identity. You can imagine children recognizing the shape of a shelter year after year. You can imagine stories forming around places. This is where your uncle hunted his first deer, and so on. Humanity was growing roots, soft roots, seasonal roots, but roots all the same. Gatherings become events as Europe warmed. Large seasonal gatherings became more frequent and more predictable. Groups might meet in open meadows during summer, river plains in spring, forest clearings in autumn, coastal areas when fish ran, thick upland valleys when herds passed. Through these gatherings were multi-purpose exchanges, ritual event, exchange-sharing, coordination, feasting, resolution, social bonding, teaching moments. No one built structures. No one declared leadership. No one organized an agenda. But these gatherings shaped identity. You are part of us. We are part of you. We remember the same stories. We meet here every year. It was the faint beginning of culture. Shared memory, shared meaning, shared belonging. Art takes a turn towards symbolism with more free time and more stable living. Art continued shifting. Portable carvings grew more detailed, abstract. Patterns became more common, tools were decorated. For the first time, cave art gained new symbols. Shared markings appeared across distant regions. Simple beads and ornaments, spread pigments, were collected. Intentionally, these weren't random doodles. They meant something to someone. Maybe status, maybe luck charms, maybe identity markers, maybe just aesthetic pleasure. Whatever the reason, humans were no longer decorating only their caves. They were decorating themselves, their tools, their objects. Symbolic thought was becoming central to life. And once humans start adding meaning to objects, everything changes. Europe becomes a network of quiet worlds by the middle of this era. Europe wasn't empty wilderness anymore. It was a wide patchwork of small human territories. Lightly inhabited, but increasingly interconnected, groups had familiar, route is familiar, meeting place familiar, rivals familiar, rivals familiar, rivers, forests and hills. They weren't tribes yet. Not in the political sense, but they were beginning to feel like long-term communities, spread out, seasonal, but connected by shared tradition. Humanity was slowly threading Europe with invisible strings. A world that finally settles down. The climate has stabilized in a way that must have felt surreal after tens of thousands of years of chaos. Warm summers, cool winters, regular rains, predictable seasons, growing forests, stable animal populations. For the first time in forever, humans could rely on the environment instead of constantly reacting to it. Nature wasn't swinging between extremes. It was offering a steady rhythm, and humans loved rhythm. Routine meant safety. Safety meant time. Time meant creativity. Creativity meant culture. And culture meant the shape of human life was about to get more interesting, new. Settlements, still simple, but more permanent in this era. Humans began building long-term camps that they returned to year after year. Not villages, not towns, just sturdier seasonal homes that stayed in the same spots for generations. These camps often included wooden frames with hide or bark coverings, woven walls, strengthened with clay, central cooking pit, storage areas lined with woven baskets, fuse pits, the prehistoric version of please don't leave bones everywhere. Sleeping zones arranged by familiar, outer work areas, more fenced spaces to keep predators away. Some were even semi-permanent, occupied for most of the year. People were still mobile, but they had home bases, now. Places with memories, stories, burials, traditions. You could walk into one of these sites after a year away and feel like nothing had changed. The quiet rise of plant management. Humans didn't invent agriculture yet, but they started nudging plants in that direction. Gently, almost accidentally, they learned which seeds sprouted better near camp, which plants regrew after harvest, to scatter seeds along path show to encourage berry bushes by clearing competing plant show to leave nuts buried so they sprouted. Near bewitch root plants got thicker when harvested. Selectively how to burn small patches to promote desirable growth. This wasn't farming. It was plant encouragement, botanical persuasion. The first whispers of agriculture were forming. Long before anyone thought of settling down for good, fishing becomes a major human lifestyle. Rivers and lakes were the Mesolithic supermarkets of Europe. People developed bone harpoons, spearhead hooks made from antler-woven nets, fish traps set in shallows, boats carved from logs or built from lashed branch-estuarying racks for fish. Preservation fishing wasn't just a side hobby. It became a central part of life. Fish provided reliable, protein-steady food in winter. Royal bones for toolskins for binding entire communities grew along lake shores and rivers, because water offered everything in many regions. These fishing cultures became so stable that they barely moved at all, living comfortably for most of the year in one place, a luxury their Ice Age ancestors couldn't dream of. Animals change how humans live with forests everywhere. Humans shifted from megafauna hunting to gathering and small game hunting. Common targets now included deer, boarek, Bar, occasionally aurochs, if someone felt brave and a little reckless. These animals required different strategies: lighter weapons, more patience, silent stalking, group coordination in full straps, rather than direct confrontation. Clawed of seasonal movement patterns. Boar hunts especially required planning, because boars are smart, fast, and extremely unimpressed by humans. Hunting these animals wasn't dramatic. It was practical, rhythmic, and predictable. And predictability is what shaped human life in this era. People start storing food for the first teamer. Huge shift happens here. Humans begin preserving food on purpose. They dried berries. They smoked meat. They cached nuts in pits lined with bark. They stored roots under layers of soil. They strung fish to dry in the wind. This allowed groups to survive winters without relying entirely on luck. Food storage was one of the first steps toward stability, and eventually toward permanent settlement. Not civilization yet, but the quiet beginning of it. Tools keep evolving. Calmly stone tools in the Mesolithic became tiny, sharp, and efficient. Microliths, small, razor-like blades, could be combined into tools. Bone and antler tools became more refined. Hooks exploded with new confidence because forests provided endless raw material. People carved bolt shafts, contended simple furniture like supports. The Mesolithic toolkit was versatile, adaptable, and surprisingly elegant. New art for a new world. The end of the Ice Age changed the artistic mood. Cave art didn't disappear, but it became less dominant as people spent more time outdoors and in woodland camps. Art turned portable. Carved, figures, decorated tools, patterned bone piece necklaces of shells and teeth beads made from stone or bone, abstract markings on wood, painted pebble, simple tattoos, yes, likely symbolic systems spread across regions, repeated shapes, lines that represented discounting marks, identity, symbols, ritual objects. This wasn't writing, but it was the early scaffolding of meaning. Humans were learning to represent ideas visually. Even if the ideas were as simple as this: Mark means our group. The emotional fabric deepens. Mesolithic people lived calmer lives than their Ice Age ancestors. And that calm allowed deeper emotional landscapes to unfold. With stability came longer child-rearing periods, stronger family groups, grief when people deepened memories across larger community estuaries that lasted generations, places that felt sacred because they'd been used for centuries. Rituals tied to seasons, personal identity, played on small flutes or simple drums. Humans were becoming recognizably human in ways we intuitively feel today, not because of technology, because of emotion. The first soft steps toward community identity as groups stayed in the same regions for generations. They developed distinctive tools, decorative patterns, ornaments, specific gathering tradition, meeting places. Myths are common, look shaped by diet and habits that outsiders could notice. These weren't tribes yet, not officially, but identity was forming. We belong here. These are our rivers. These are our hills. We return here every year. This was the beginning of regional human cultures. Still simple, still flexible, but unmistakably real.